Welcome to OSP319, taking Office to the cloud. And we're going to talk today about Office predominantly, but also, there'll be a little bit of SharePoint in there, and we'll talk a bit about Office 365 and how that factors into this integration between, the Office system and Windows Azure. My name is Steve Fox. I'm a director at Microsoft in a group called Developer and Platform Evangelism. We do a lot of things working with customers, building out sample code, building developer kits, and I'll reference one near the end that you can go where you can get some more information. My particulars, including my email, blog, and Twitter. If you want to ping me afterwards with any questions, feel free to reach out. And I try, on a semi-regular basis, update my blog with code. If there's something particular you're looking for, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, because chances are it's kicking around somewhere in our office. But with that said, here's my agenda, a little bit of background, a bunch of walkthroughs. We'll do a summary, okay? In terms of walkthroughs, generally the style I like to roll with is give you an architecture slide of what we're looking at and then kind of walk through a demo. Very kind of prescriptive how-to sort of thing. And near the end, like I said, I'll have a training kit that will provide a little more information as to a lot of the things that you're going to see today. So in case you're thinking, oh, I didn't catch that step, you can get that and download it afterwards and actually walk through and get the code, okay? So don't fear that you need to write all this stuff down. I think the important takeaway is that you understand how these things fit together and the types of things that you can do. I'm going to have about 5 demos. Steve Hansen down here in the front's going to join me later to do the final demo. But leading into that, we've got a number of different demos that will range from no-code solutions using Windows, Azure, Data Marketplace, and Excel, to InfoPath, to custom services deployed into Windows Azure, to add-ins, document-level solutions, all the way down to external content types, BCS, SQL, Azure, and of course then Windows Phone, Windows Azure plugged into Excel services. So we got a pretty broad array of examples we'll walk through. So lots of stuff that we'll talk about. Now, if you have any questions, just shout it out. Put your hand up, shout it out. I like to have an interactive session. Don't sit on questions. I'll repeat it so there's no need to run up to the microphone, and we can go from there, okay? So to start out with, just to set the context as to why would we even think about bringing these two technologies together, first of all, how many of you are familiar with Windows Azure? Oh, only a couple of you. Okay. Well, I'll give you a little bit of a drill down, or at least a high-level introduction of Windows Azure. In fact, what I'll do is I had a hidden slide just in case folks weren't familiar with it. So I'll bring that up front. And pull it up here, and we can just talk about that first thing here. But first of all, let's just talk a bit about why, and then I'll jump back to the unhidden slide. So in terms of why, the big thing with Windows Azure is cost optimization. And what that means is we have all this cloud compute and storage and all these resources out there in data centers across the world. Well, it stands to reason that they can scale, they're more elastic, more reliable than if you're actually running things on premises. And what that means is, let's say you have a training solution and you, for example, have all of these big video files, right? And you want to avoid running up against storage problems internally. What you can do is you can use blob storage in Windows Azure, and you don't have to worry about running up against the storage wall, right? Likewise, if you think about services, you want to make your WCF service broadly available to your customers and maybe even sell it on a subscription basis, then the cloud provides that avenue for you to do things like that, right? So there's a cost optimization side to this, and then there's a breadth and resource side to it as well in terms of getting your services out there and potentially leveraging data. The other thing is, an example we talked a bit about earlier on the week was the Contoso oil and gas example. We had all these gas stations, right? And they're submitting data into this database that's basically accruing transactions. You can kind of, again, have this idea of hardware on premises kind of, running through all these transactions, or you could have that in the cloud. And so you have the scalability. You don't have to worry about kind of, again, running up against a wall. And all you need to worry about is just getting that data down in a snapshot and having some sort of view in that in documents or in SharePoint dashboards and whatnot, right? So there's definitely value to the cloud. How valuable it is, obviously, you'll have to take a look at what your organization is doing and architecting, but definitely some interesting things that you can do. Now, my assumption here is most of you are developers, right? Yeah? Okay, this is a 300 level course, so we'll probably look at, again, no code but code. And so when we think about things like Office server-side services, new paradigm in 2010 where you can begin to look at taking SharePoint and then leveraging things like Word services, Excel services, JavaScript, jQuery, and getting a little more creative there on the client. And definitely Windows Azure has a place where it can integrate there. And of course, extending Office in new ways, especially when we think about Office 365, right? We have to think a little more broadly now and definitely think more in the cloud in terms of building solutions. And so that's kind of the why and sets the context. So I'm not going to yammer on too much more. I do want to go through things and show you stuff as opposed to giving you theory. Now, since, again, a lot of you are new to Windows Azure, I'll just give you the 1-minute kind of rundown of what it is. Simply put, in fact, I was doing a session, it must have been about 2 months ago, and to a group of professors, and they were like, what is this thing? I can't figure it out. Just give me a 1-sentence explanation, please. Because, you know, there's a lot of cloud vernacular coming out of Microsoft. Cloud this, cloud that, to the cloud, cloud power. People are like, what the heck is this thing called the cloud? Windows Azure, in essence, is an operating system in the cloud. That was my, you know, description to this gentleman who asked me. I was like, that's as simple as I can put it. It's a little more reductionist than I'd like. But in essence, what it represents is a place where you can essentially drop code. You can, you know, manage resources. It's compute and storage. So if we think about Windows Azure, you'll see that I have a developer portal that I can manage my code in and out of the cloud. And of course, there's this scalability factor and whatnot. But definitely there's management capabilities, storage capabilities. So if you look at Windows Azure, there's also SQL Azure, and you could think of that as the, you know, SQL server in the cloud. It's slightly different architecture, but relational databases. And then Windows Azure App Fabric, which is essentially a service bus. And you'll see an example later on when Steve comes up. Essentially, App Fabric allows us to take services in the cloud and connect them to on-premises. I wouldn't say circumventing the firewall, but certainly having a direct service-to-service endpoint connection, which is very useful. You know, because he's going to show you Windows Phone 7 example. But I think the extrapolation there is you can actually take the service bus and begin to build applications that are iPhone, iPad, Windows Phone 7, cross-device on that same code base, which is huge, right? Because if you talk to CTOs today, they don't want to maintain 6 code bases, you know? So think about that. So these are the 3 constituent major parts of Windows Azure. So when I say Windows Azure, I kind of include these things, okay? Fair enough? Any questions on what Windows Azure is before I move on to make sure we're all on the same page? You're all good? All righty. So points of integration, I'm going to go through a lot of these, but there's lots of different ways that you can integrate with Office. You'll see a few of these today. For example, Excel services, InfoPath, SharePoint Designer mostly, and then we'll do some Visual Studio work, show some code. And of course, it's going to cut across Office and Office 365. Very quickly, Office 365 comprises 4 pieces: Office Pro Plus, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Lync Online. So when I say Office, I actually incorporate both because Office and Office Professional Plus, because it's included in Office 365, is pretty much the same thing. You have the same developer story that translates across on the client across Office and Office 365. Okay? So I just wanted to throw that out there. I don't want to dig too deep into this particular slide. I want to instead jump into the first demo and start actually looking at some, you know, some hookup here between Windows Azure and Office. So the first example here, what I want to do is I actually want to leverage Excel services, okay? We're going to build out an Excel document. It's going to connect to what is called the Azure Marketplace Data Market. One of my favorite subscriptions is the data.gov. I use this all the time. It's just really easy to use, get up and running. And so I'm going to have an Excel client. It's just going to be a simple document. It's going to use just a connection that we're going to build out and drop in to this Excel document, and we're going to publish it out to Excel services, okay? Just to get things warmed up here. And the process I went to create that on the right-hand side there, create the document. There's an add-in that you can download from the Azure Marketplace that allows you to go ahead and build a connection with the Azure Marketplace data. And then I'm going to create a pivot table, upload the document to SharePoint, expose via Excel services, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to build a little crime dashboard. So the first thing I'll do is jump over to this laptop here. For those of you who haven't seen this, this is Azure Data Marketplace. Let's do one thing here. I think I might have forgotten to put my Zoom It on. Got to have your Zoom It. There it is. Okay. Okay. There we go. So if you're looking to get up and running on Data Market, all you need to do is get a live ID, go to this URL, and then you can begin to just work with the subscription data. Now, essentially what this site is, it allows you to go ahead and download a Data Market Excel add-in, which I've already done. But more importantly here, if you go into My Data, it allows you to browse subscription-based data. Okay, and this is data that lives on Azure. For the most part, this is RESTified data, so you can basically have REST URIs and execute queries against that data. Here, this is the data.gov I was talking about. We can go here, explore the data set, and you can see there's different ways to explore that data. For example, we can click Explore this data set, go into it. You can see that I've got a little bit of almost an in-browser tool here that allows me to do some filtering. Click Run Query, go ahead, grabs that data, and here you can see that I've got some data that's returned from that data source in the cloud. Now, the point is, this is hosted data. You could build your own subscriptions, publish them into the data market, and make some money off it if you wanted to. Or all these other companies are out there building data sets that you can consume, such as census data or crime data or other types of interesting data that you can then begin to build into applications. Okay, now there's two sides to this, right? I can take this data here, and then again, as I showed you before, I can go to, where is it, the home page here. Let's go back and go into downloading this, this PowerPoint or this Excel add-in. And then what happens is, if we go back over here to my other guy here, let's drop into, show you the Excel add-in. Basically what you get with the Excel add-in, if I can get there, there we go, you'll see that it loads up in the Data tab. Let's kill that. It's got this special little guy here, import data from Data Market. Now, when you sign up for the Windows Azure Marketplace Data Market, you're going to get an account key. And so you use that account key to program against it, right? So you just pass through, if you're going to code, you pass that account key through when you're actually interacting with the Data Market. But here you can see that on the right-hand side, I've just by virtue of having this add-in into my Excel document, I now have access to this data from the Azure Data Marketplace. And I can go ahead and say, well, I'm going to import that data, and then it's going to pull all that data in, or at least give me a dialog where I can pull some information in. And again, in the spirit of showing you the same thing that I showed you in the browser, let's go ahead and add that and import the data. Well, that's not true. Let's get rid of that. That should import something. That will go out and bring in some data. And this is all of the data that you just saw in the browser in my Excel document, okay? So you can see here that I've made a connection, but at some level I'm going to break this connection, right? Because I'm going to take this document, I've pulled this data from the Data Market, I'm going to take the document, I'm going to create some pivot table, I'm going to push it into SharePoint via Excel services. Okay, now many of you I'm sure have created pivot tables. If you haven't, it's just a matter of going over here and insert pivot table and pivot charts and whatnot, and you can have some fun. And you can see here I've got a little table here. I've got another table here that represents where I live in King County, some of the different crime rates, and you can see I've got a chart here that's called Chart 1. Now, the next thing I would do is just take this document, essentially, go ahead, click File, Save and Send, Save to SharePoint, Publish Options, and for those of you who are familiar with Excel services would know that here is where I would select certain items, and I can publish those, and when I publish that up to SharePoint, I can consume that in different ways, right? The interesting thing is I can consume it in two ways. The first is just statically through a document. The second way is programmatically through a REST URI, okay? Because Excel services has REST capabilities that are built into it, so I can begin to use this document as my my de facto source of data. And so if we go back to my SharePoint site here, here's my SharePoint site. Let's go to the, let me see, crime and crime dashboard. Let's take a look at this. You can see that all I've done here is literally gone into the page, gone into Edit, and I've basically inserted web part. It's a business data web part, Excel web access, and I'm pointing to elements of that Excel document, okay? And that's really, at the end of the day, what we're doing here, and those Excel documents are literally pointing to named ranges inside of that particular document. The other thing here, I'll show you, this is the REST URI capability here. So you can see here that I'm pointing to an exact chart that I have inside that document that then is also exposed inside of my SharePoint site. The point is, really no code at all. I've taken information from Azure, I've pulled it in, and I've exposed it in a document, and I've pushed it into SharePoint. Now, yes, there is a broken connection, so every time you want to refresh that, you have to go about, obviously taking that data back down and republishing it. So if you were looking for something that is, you want to keep fresh all the time, then maybe you need to do something programmatically. Now, the other thing I've built here, and we can walk through this later if you're interested, but this is basically where I've used that same URI, and I've basically created a connection, a programmatic connection to that data, right? And so you can use the HTTP web request object to go about interacting with that data, pull it back, and expose it in SharePoint as well. So literally here, I always have the latest because I'm using it programmatically here. And with regard to Excel, over here, I've got that connections as broken, but I still have that data coming from Windows Azure. Okay? So that, in essence, is the first demo here, kind of just getting us into things, very, just kind of no-code solutions. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay. So let's talk a bit more about code, because I know a lot of you developers, and you want to see what's going on behind the scenes here. This next one here is where we'll consume a custom service. The first one, existing service. Here we'll talk about custom services. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a little WCF service that will deploy into Windows Azure, and then we'll use that in different ways within Office. One will be within InfoPath. One will be within Excel services and JavaScript. And then you'll see how those two things factor in, okay? So basically, the architecture here on the SharePoint side of things, we have SharePoint Server. And in the context of JavaScript and jQuery, understand that I could take this and extrapolate this out to Office 365. So the JavaScript and jQuery libraries would work in the cloud as long as my service lives in Windows Azure, because that lives in the cloud as well. And then I'm going to have my get credit score that I will actually deploy into Windows Azure. Okay? Let's go over, and what we'll do is we'll create a new project here. Now, for those of you who have not built a Windows Azure project before, essentially you need to download the Windows Azure SDK. Okay? Click New Project. And basically we have the cloud project here. We can go ahead and click OK. And that will allow us to build certain options. Okay? For those of you who can't see that, there we go. We have web roles, service roles, worker roles, all different types of roles. Okay? The one we want to do here is we want to choose the web service role, WCF service. I can go ahead and edit that if I wanted to. Click OK. And that's going to create a project structure for me. Now, most of you have probably created a service before, right? Is that correct? Yes? You love services. But for most of you, you've probably deployed them to a local IIS domain, right? Basically, the difference here is you're taking this service code, and all you're doing is deploying out to a data center, an IIS instance that's running in a data center that's obviously outside the firewall. And so in this sense, all we're doing is we can go here, and we have our standard structure of a service. But the key is down at the bottom here, and this is where the Windows Azure part comes in. We have this special configuration information that wraps around our code. And so when we deploy that into Windows Azure, this allows us to run that code in Windows Azure. Okay? Now, before we go too much further, let's jump over and just take a look at what Windows Azure looks like. This is your portal. Okay? Oops. I don't want help. I want to windows.azure.com. There's free trial accounts if you haven't set one up yet. It sounds like there's only a handful here probably who have done that, and you probably want to explore it a little more. This is my developer portal in the cloud. You can see that I've got reporting, service bus, hosted services. So if I go and click hosted services, these are where I've got my roles that I've created in the cloud. And here's my TechEd 2011. And I've actually deployed a service that has this get credit score web method in it. Okay? So essentially, what I'm doing is I'm actually calling this guy, and you can see if you go here that it's the TechEd 2011 namespace. All right? So it lives in the cloud. It doesn't live on my local premises, local host. And then what I can do is you can see in my WSDL I actually have, if you can load that up. You can see that I've got that credit score down there. There we go. That I got credit score as one of my web methods. Okay? So the point is, it lives in the cloud. This is not kind of smoke and mirrors. I'm literally taking this code and pushing it up. Now, I've pushed it up already because it takes about 10 minutes to actually go ahead and push the service up and refresh it. And I think it was over here. But let's go ahead. We'll just take a look at the service contract here. And I think probably what we want to do here is get rid of this guy. And where's our contract? Let's do this. Operation contract. We're not going to do this one here. We'll do the second one. Get credit score. We'll get rid of this other GUI here. And that should give us basically just a very simple contract. The service code will be equally as compelling. We'll go down. Kill that. And so where's our get crime data? Or that's not the one we want. We want get credit score. Okay, so if we take a look at this, basically all we're doing is we're going to implement a get credit score method that's going to return a random value between a bottom of 550 and a top of 800, right? And you can imagine what I'm going to be doing based off of that figure. I may adjust interest rates, blah-de-blah-de-blah, something, right? There's some decision that's going to be made off that random figure coming back. But the point is, we're going to take this code and we'll basically deploy this into Azure. Now, the way in which we do that, so at this point I have a working service. The one thing I will add that if you want to call this service from things like Silverlight, you have to make sure you have your cross-domain files included in your project before you deploy them. Otherwise, the Silverlight call won't succeed. But in essence, what we do then at this point is I just go ahead and publish. And you can see I create a service package, click OK. And what that will do, it will create all the necessary files, the configuration file and the package file for my code. And it'll take just a second here. And it'll give me this nice little folder that I can go over here to my guy here. And I can click on the particular role, click Upgrade, Browse Locally, and go ahead. And I could add my service package, browse locally. I can add, sure you can. There we go, configuration file. And I can click OK. I won't because it'll take 10 minutes to update. But the point is, that's the connection, okay? You do have a local development environment that you can use with Windows Azure if you just want to test it locally. You can certainly do that, but then that's essentially how you would update the code. So at this point, now what I have is I have a working crime data service that I have in the cloud. And so I can do all sorts of things with that particular service. So the first thing is, let's go ahead and go back. Now that we have this nice little service working, let's go back to my home site here. One of the key things that I did was I created a customers list. And what I want to do with this customers list, if we go into the list settings and click Customize Form, is I want to actually build out a connection to that credit score service. So every time I enter in a particular line item, it takes some information, goes out, calls that credit score, comes back, and issues a some sort of interest rate or approval for a particular loan. And InfoPath is great because it very easily allows you to go ahead and create connections to services or data. Again, I'm not going to walk through every single process. What I will do at the end is point you to the kit. You can download it, and all this is in there, and so you can get it today. But in essence, I can literally go into my Click Submit button here. I can go ahead and, let me see, go into Data. I can go ahead and show fields, manage rules, all these different things that I can basically create a rule within my InfoPath form that allow me to call out to that service and then bring it back. And so what that means is when I go back into my form here and I go add a new item, and just ignore that for the time being, I can go ahead and create a customer name. I can create an SSN, date of birth, customer address, 123 Happy Street, and employer name, annual salary. The nice thing with InfoPath is you can also have some formatting on the InfoPath form. create a personal loan, etc. Other details, and I click submit. And that would, though, go in. Let me see here. We'll just jump back to my other thing here. And what would happen is it would call out that particular service, and what you would get as a result of that is here where you see on the credit score, and you get a loan amount, and then you could actually go ahead and approve that loan as a part of a workflow process, right? But the point is, you can tie it to InfoPath forms. Now, the interesting thing here is you can actually go into the cloud in Office 365, and I'm not sure if you're aware of the sandbox solution limitation. Has anybody heard about this? In the cloud within SharePoint Online, you can have sandbox solutions, but you can't make external service calls. InfoPath form services in the cloud, you actually can. So literally what that means is I can build forms in the cloud that connect up the WCF services that I can then do some processing. So you can do some pretty interesting things there. Okay? Any questions on that? All right, so let's jump back. One other thing I'll show you. In the context of going back to our site, browse. Where was I? Oh. Do a credit check. The last thing I'll show you here is you can also embed this in jQuery and JavaScript. This is just an example where I've taken the service and I've tied it to jQuery. And now what I can do is I can do some processing directly in the client, okay? So Steve Fox, 123 Street, SSN. Okay? I click Get Data. What that does is it goes out, it grabs that credit score. Based on the credit score, then it does some rationalization of an interest rate, which then you can see updates a part of an Excel Web Access named range that's actually embedded in the page. The interesting thing is this all happens on the client, right? Everything has happened based on that service call, and then it actually does some updating on the client. Again, this works in Office 365, and it also works within SharePoint as well. So interesting stuff that you can do across InfoPath and across jQuery and JavaScript. Okay? I've actually got this code posted on my blog, so again, I'm not going to jump into this just to save some time, but it's definitely something you can check out. So to take a step back for a second, let's jump into the deck, and we'll kind of just figure out where we're at here. We've talked a bit about no-code solutions with Excel. We've talked about InfoPath with a code solution where we've got this get credit score that we've dropped into Windows Azure, and we're pulling back and consuming that with an InfoPath and Excel services. What I'd like to do now is move forward and talk a bit about data, because data is a very interesting thing in the context of Windows Azure. Literally, there's different types of data that we can look at, right? If you think about Windows Azure proper, you have blob storage, you have table storage, and you have queue storage, okay? Blob storage is essentially where I could take video files, image files, whatever blob files I have, and I can push them into Windows Azure and have them stored there and retrieve them, right? The second one I have in terms of table storage, it's non-relational data, right? It's basically just tables that I could then use and build out in Windows Azure and then consume in some way, shape, or form in Office. And the third one, queue storage, is basically eventing, right? You could think of. And so in this next exercise, what I'll do is I'll build out an Excel document that then leverages table storage in the cloud, okay? I'm going to create the Excel document level add-in, create a product class, create some context and helper classes that we're going to use. Then I'll add functionality to the workbook, basically to help me bring that data from the Windows Azure table storage into the context of Excel. Okay? You guys still excited? You still awake? All right. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So, Excel mortgage app. Here we go. So, I don't know how many of you have built document level solutions or add-ins. Has anybody built any document level solutions here or add-ins? A few of you? Okay, interesting. So a lot of you haven't. So basically how you build these things is if you go into, let's go back here, if you go into create a new project, within Office, you have this Office here, and you can create, because we're talking about 2010 here, you can create different types of artifacts. You can create an add-in, which essentially loads every time you open up Excel, or you can build a very specific template or document, right? Which means that I could take that template and I could, for example, create a content type in SharePoint. So if I have a document library and I have this really customized HR document I want to have associated with that document library, I could then build one and associate it with that particular document library. And literally all you do is just, go ahead and click OK, and it'll create all that information for you within the project file, but then you would deploy it, and then every time you open up Outlook in this case, you would see your functionality. Now, I've gone ahead and did the same thing here with, let me see, let's just kill this, with an Excel document. And you can see here if we go into looking at the sheet, you can actually view the sheet in a designer mode, which is interesting because what this means is your actual document becomes a designer surface. So this is what my document would look like when I actually create it and deploy it. Okay, and it's a document level add-in, so literally I could take this and bind it to a content type in SharePoint or just use it independently. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to use some information that's stored in Windows Azure in table storage. Again, why would I do that? Because I don't have to worry about, updating that information potentially. Maybe I'm plugging into, some sort of service that they maintain, and I don't have to worry about it. And in this case, what we're doing is we're a Contosa real estate company, and we're very interested in making sure that we can get the latest monthly mortgage payments. Okay? So you can see there's 3 controls here. I've got this button, retrieve lending rates, and a couple of drop-down boxes. And you can imagine I'm going to click the button, go out to table storage, grab some information, and populate these drop-down boxes with something. Another question is, what am I going to populate them with? Now, in the context of Visual Studio 2010 on the left-hand side here, you can see that you have this Server Explorer. What's really nice about the Server Explorer is you can actually visualize data within Windows Azure, which can be kind of a pain if you've used Windows Azure before, right? Previously, you didn't really have a great way to visualize this. So now you can actually see when you're building out table objects what these things look like. So I can go ahead and double-click that. This is exactly what that table looks like. It's got partition key, row key, et cetera, all these different bits of information that I can then use inside of my document. Okay? Likewise, I have product information, and I have sale observation. Okay? Are you guys comfortable with me in the code? You're all good with this? Okay, good. It's 300 level session, so that's kind of what I would expect. So let's go back just for a second here. View Designer. Double click there, and then we'll open this up. Now again, there's a number of different helper classes here that help me structure my data, but you can see here once I click that button, I'm going to create a data context. I walk through, I'm going to select some information in that data context, and I've got this in-memory object called lending institution, right? But it's just basically an emulation of the table storage data, right? It's my in-memory class object that I'm using to represent the data that's coming from table storage. Iterate through, I have a list collection, I go ahead and LI rates is my list collection. I add it on and sort of populate that data. And then what I do, you can see here in combo box lenders.data source and combo box lenders.display member. That just basically takes that data and begins to bind it with my controls inside of my actual worksheet. Okay? And of course, if you change that, that's going to go down and then change the actual graph on my Excel document. Okay? Very simply, that's what it's going to do. And you can see here that I've got cells that have values that will be assigned some sort of value based on the changes that I issue inside of my combo box. Okay? So if you go back, click F5. Any questions while this is loading up? You guys are like, where's the coffee? All right, so this will load up. Now you can see here's my Excel document level add-in. Okay? I've got my retrieve lending rates. That's going to go out because the data context. It's going to grab that data, and then hopefully here in a second, there we go, it'll populate those controls. So you can see retrieve lending rates, Woodgrove Bank, awesome. Now watch the other part of the document when I go ahead and let's say, okay, let's select Woodgrove Bank, and I'll go ahead and select, 4.25. You can see that based on externally saved data in Windows Azure in table storage, I can now bring that in and change, obviously, the amortization, or at least the reflection of that, in my monthly mortgage payment here within Excel. Okay? But the point is external data. I don't have to worry about it. All I have to worry about is making sure that I have the right data context to then update my Excel document. Okay? Does that make sense? Yeah? Are you guys pumped and ready to go? You guys are like, oh my God. All right. So I know this can get kind of tedious after 4 days of tech ed, Constant sessions. Okay, so that was kind of an example of an Excel document level solution. Okay? All right, so let's jump out of this here. And if you saved this document, know that all the data that comes back into it, it would save as that static document, right? But every time you have the document open, you could refresh it. But just when you save it, it saves whatever the latest snapshot of that data was. Okay. So let's go back to our deck and find out where we were. Mortgage calculator. So this is an interesting one. Business connectivity services. Who knows what BCS is? One guy down here. Okay. So business connectivity services is very interesting. It's new with 2010. It allows you to essentially take line of business systems and connect it into SharePoint in this sense, right? It's essentially, a connection point. So if I had SAP, if I had PeopleSoft, if I had SQL Server, I could build a connection point with these systems and then visualize that data inside of SharePoint. So for example, if we take a look at what that looks like, this guy over here, let me go back into here. This is an example of me loading up external data, okay? And I've built this using basically SharePoint Designer, which is a declarative tool. But it just basically built this through a wizard that connects me to a SQL Azure instance of data, and that data is here, right? So you can see that down here, pfb blah, 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 .database.windows, .whatever. That's the namespace for my database that lives in the cloud. This is not local. So that connection point is kind of pointing to this SQL Azure database that's off into the cloud. And this is interesting because if you've got people who are pushing data transactions into some database off into the cloud, you just want to create a connection. BCS allows you to do just that. Okay? So the question is, how do I go about doing that? And so I wanted to walk you through this example, and let me just walk you through the architecture before we actually go ahead and do it, because there's multiple pieces to this. The first is the data. The data is going to live in a database in SQL Azure, right? It's in the cloud. And then we're going to create what's called an external content type. All that is an XML file. Doesn't matter what it looks like to you guys. All you need to know is it's a connection point to this data that's going to surface it in an external list. The external list, what I just showed you, is basically a list that just dynamically loads that data and lives in SharePoint. Why am I doing that as kind of the proxy between this data that lives here and my Word add-in that I'll eventually create? Because there's two levels here. The first is you can have an information worker who can actually control and update that information from within the external list, right? So I can literally go over here, and my job every day could be coming in here and making sure that all of the store information here is up to date. Awesome. That could be part of my job. And really all I need to do is go, hey, I'm going to go in here, edit view item, and literally I could edit this and it updates the database, all right? Or I would update SAP, or I would update PeopleSoft. The point is I have a point of reference that I have connection-wise with my external data source, okay? Now again, if you were doing something like PeopleSoft or SAP, the web service connection would have to be a little more difficult. You'd have to code that up, but in this case it's fairly simple. So what we'll do, jump back here, go in here. SharePoint Designer is where we're going to start. And you can see that I've got external content types here. I click external content type to create that XML file. Go ahead, T2011, T2011. Generic list. You can have different lists that you can select here. And the reason I'm showing you this is because you can not only expose this in SharePoint, you can push this out to Office as well, okay? So I can go ahead and, let's say, click Contact. It's enabled. Click here to discover. Add a connection point. Go ahead, type SQL Server. And where's my database name? Here it is here. Go ahead. Click Customers. Now we run into a problem. Can anybody guess what the problem is going to be with SQL Azure? This is audience involvement time. Can anybody guess? SQL Azure runs on a different set of credentials, right? If you're using SQL Server, you're within domain. Because SQL Azure lives in the cloud, we have to negotiate a separate set of credentials, okay? So at this point, I'm like, I can't connect with my user's identity because that's just going to pass on my local domain credentials, and it won't rationalize with this SQL Azure instance. So at this point, it's like, okay, well, what do I do? Essentially, what you need to do is you have to have some way to have a handshake with that particular external data source. And you go in here into central admin, into stored services, secure store service rather, and you go click new. And basically, that will create an app ID, which is our handshake, okay? It's just basically a security handshake that allows us to go ahead and interact with that external data source. I've already created one here. Let me see here. It was called Azure App ID. So I can go Azure App ID. Then I'll go, sorry, put that here because we're impersonating the identity. And we'll just say stores. And what happens when I click OK, now I perform, let's go STFX. And I think it's, that should then connect, provide a link for me in SharePoint Designer, but it's actually connected out to an external data source. Okay, so at this point, what I can do is, what was that called? Stores, here we go. I can see my tables. That's loading that up. I want store information. I can create all operations. This is where the CRUD capabilities are built into that external list. And I can walk through this process. And let's see here, store ID, office properties here. You have to actually take the store name. We'll just map it to the last name to get rid of that error. And there we go. We can just ignore the other ones. Not enough data to be a filter. And there we go, we have the ability to actually create the list by creating a list in form. And then, of course, we save that content type, et cetera, et cetera. But now we have the ability to go ahead and get back to where we were, which is this guy here. Eventually, when we create that list, it's saved, and we can update the external data source. So the point is, why am I telling you all this, right? Because when we've kind of come to this point where we now have a list, I can update it as an information worker, but I can also use this programmatic within SharePoint. And I can also use this programmatically within Office. This could be my central data source, right? So just remember, it serves multiple purposes, okay? All right, so at this point, we now have a list. And let's go into a project, which is my PO project here. Again, how did I get here? Basically went into Microsoft Visual Studio, clicked yes, clicked New Project, Office 2010. I believe this is a Word add-in. So I went Word add-in here, clicked OK, and then it built out a project structure for me. And here, the project structure is basically I've got a custom task pane, okay? A custom task pane, for those of you who don't know, is basically this is task pane to the right of Word, and you can use it for various things, right? We see a lot of people using it to bring data in and out of a document, and then to push that data into a document or do some sort of processing, right? In this case, I've overlaid a nice little XAML, basically a WPF app on top of that, so it looks pretty, which it won't because I'm really lame at design, but it theoretically could look pretty. Let's put it that way. And you can see here that I've got one thing I've added in here, which is this Microsoft.SharePoint.client. And you can see I'm using SP Client OM because there could potentially be namespace clashes with apps, so I sometimes put that in there depending on the app. This is the SharePoint Client Object Model and will allow me to take a Word document and interact directly with that external list, which is pulling data from SQL Azure. Okay, so I kind of have this daisy chain, and I'll show you why I have that in just a sec. But for the purposes of this particular demo, I've got this assembly that I need to add into there. And then all I'm doing is really creating in-memory objects, list store, which is basically, again, a class. I'm going to go through. The globals is just basically a globals object that allows you to get to various parts of your Office add-in. Okay? And when I click that button, which you're going to see when I run this in a bit, I'm going to click the button. It's going to grab some information from my, oops, we need to go ahead and get this guy here. Obviously forgot to put that there. Okay, there we go. It's going to set the context for my local SharePoint instance. And then, do that one more time. And then what we'll do is we'll iterate through. It's going to get the list by title, which is Contoso Stores Azure. And it's just basically going to create an in-memory instance of that in my custom task pane. Literally, that's all it's going to do. And again, we've got this with code, and we'll publish the code so you can see it a little later on. You don't need to have to, worry about this right now. The point is, object model, interacting with my external list, pulling it into Word, and then allow me to manage data in and out of the document. Okay? Very simply put, that's all we're doing. Now, one thing I will draw your attention to here is this right here. This is where I'm actually going into the data, return data that's coming out of the call into SharePoint, that external list, and I've got element at 1, 3, 4, 5. Notice it's not sequential, because when you're using BCS, you don't always have that sequential kind of this particular data. It's not predictable, right? Some of these things could be in different places. So just remember, you have to take a look at the data structure coming back when you actually interact with that data stream. So let's go ahead, and we will F5 this bad boy. And hopefully it will build. Yay, it built. So it launches Word. And then what will happen, you see here's the custom task pane on the right-hand side. As you can see, my design skills are superior, so please hold your applause. And then we can go ahead and click Retrieve Store Data. That's going to go back, and it's going to read the data from essentially SQL Azure via my external list. Okay? And then what I can do is I can take this, and I can say, hey, well, I'll take that, and I'll insert some store information. You can see that it was updated there inside my document. Now, this is, interesting in some sense. It brings data that's, again, external to the document back into the document, but there are other things that you can do with this external list as well. So, for example, here's another application that I built, and here is where I've taken that same external list, is plugged into SQL Azure, and I'm repurposing that data across another application within SharePoint, okay? Using the client object model, this is the data, comes in and populates this list here. I'm using Bing Maps to show exactly where that store is located. Click zoom, woo, there we go. Zooms in on the particular store, takes some sales data, and at the same time aggregates it into a Silverlight toolkit down there below, right? So the point is, you can have this one reference point for that data, but use it in multiple places, one of which could be Microsoft Word. Okay? Fair enough? Is that fairly clear? And again, if you want this code, let me know. I'm happy to send you this Silverlight code. It's kind of cool. In fact, we have some brochures, some teaser books down at the booth that actually have a walkthrough of this in it as well. So lots of resources there for you. Okay. That said, that in essence was this bad boy right there. So SQL Azure data, external list as our intermediary. We built that using SharePoint Designer, our Word add, and then consume that using the client object model. Okay? So this is where what we're going to do is Stevie is going to come up in there in a bit. But I'll talk through exactly what's going on in this particular solution, because this is where things may get a little hairy. Basically, we're going to have a remote device that will talk to a service deployed into the cloud. It's going to use a service bus to talk back to Excel services that basically live on premise, okay? And then what will happen is we'll work with a SharePoint list, and that will expose some data back out to the device. Now, this is a very interesting scenario for a couple of reasons. A, as I mentioned before, you now have a way to actually build out some code that you can then use, as long as it's WCF conversant, across different devices and different platforms. Which is really nice. The second thing is now I have a way where I can actually drop a service into the cloud, and I can basically just have a direct connection to SharePoint on-premise, right? And literally what that means is I can have my phone anywhere in the world. I can be reading and writing data. I could do it basically with the server object model on SharePoint, or I could use Excel services on the Office side and have that interaction there as well. So I think this is an interesting pattern. Steve, if you want to come up and walk through your demo. Let's welcome Steve up. Give him a hearty round of applause.
Thank you. Good morning. All right. So I've been listening in. It's been all great, and I love what you can do with Azure, and I've kind of looked at from a different perspective. And one question that I'd like to know is people here who's got some complex Office documents, might be VBA or Excel models in your organization? Just about everybody, right? So the way I look at it is I've developed a lot of solutions around Excel. My background is also in finance, blend finance with computer technology. That's me. So what I want to do is figure out, I've built these Excel-based solutions for years. What can we do with today's technology? What can we do to leverage this in different ways? We've got all these different devices. We've got phones we want to access this data from. We've got iPads. We've got iPhones. How do we reuse all of this business knowledge we've got in our documents? So what I did was I've got a Excel workbook here. It was really inspired by a real-world application, and it's a TCO model, so total cost of ownership. And so the scenario is you work for a company, you sell premium priced products. Okay, they cost more than all the competitors. So the salespeople have a tough time. They can't just go sell on price. They really got to explain that the reason that you're paying more is because over the life that you own this product, you're going to actually pay less than your competitors. So we've got to look at the total cost of ownership. And to build those models, a lot of times it takes a finance person. The models contain a ton of financial calculations, but the person using them is a salesperson who's not finance. So we got to make them really simple. So Excel is kind of a natural choice to do that. Let me see which, remember which one I was. Oh. Nope. As soon as we see some fish swimming. There's too many things here. No. There's not too many more buttons I can push. E. Let me try E. E's not lit up. Ooh, that's it. Okay, so I'm going to bring up the TCO model here, and I'm going to bring it up in Excel services. The original version, it was a classical, what I call classic Office solution, just a complex Excel document with some VBA in it. So now I've got all these TCO models stored in a SharePoint document library. And so all of these models represent a model for a particular customer. And so the way that a salesperson would use these is they'd go in and they'd enter information about the customer. In this case, we're selling combines, high-cost farm implements. So the first thing we do would be to enter our customer information, some of the specifics about their farm, stuff like that. The next thing we do is select which combines that customer is currently evaluating, along with the one we'd like to sell them. Okay, so we'd enter the, what those combines are, the selling price, and some of the variables we need to calculate the total cost of ownership. We want to make this easy to use for our salespeople. Ultimately, the thing that they care about is this TCO result, a couple of charts, a couple of stats, and then just a pre-printed letter that it was a lead behind. So this, if we open it up in Excel client, would be a traditional use of Excel. Now, the customer, there were some problems with this. One of these is these models get duplicated all over the place, and they have a really hard time. There's a lot of proprietary information and calculations in this workbook. They don't really want those to get out. They don't want them to get out to customers. So they're very selective on who they give the model to. Also, because of all the calculations in it, the thought about rewriting this in .NET or anywhere else is horrifying as a developer. Of all the calculations and trying to recreate that in code, tedious. I don't want to do that work. So what we'd like to do and what you can do with Excel services is you can have a finance person create this. We put it in Excel services, and then we reuse it as basically a component that we're going to call into. So that's great because then we can create a .NET application, Silverlight, whatever, to get at this. But with Azure, it also gave us a way to get at this from any device. And so I'm going to show that here. We'll get the phone fired up. light on. Make sure. So here I've got my SharePoint document library. I've got these models in it. I've got a WCF service running internally on this SharePoint, which is in Minneapolis, by the way. We're actually VPN'd into my network. And then I've got the phone here, which is going through. I've got 3G or Wi-Fi's backup. It's going to go through to Windows Azure, a service I've got out there. It's going to use the service bus to connect to the service I've got on my SharePoint box. And then it's going to go into this document. Let me go back to TCO here. And retrieve information. Now, the idea for this was that we really want to create a UI that embraced the Windows Phone 7 design objectives. Uh-oh. Let me make sure we've got a connection here. Check one other thing. My service probably is asleep. Either that or it's Steve Fox. He's always bad luck, I tell you. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, so there we go. We've got our, if you notice the documents in this display here, they're actually all the documents in my SharePoint document library. Presumably, we'd have more than just a handful of documents, and it also uses familiar UI from the phone, a long list selector here. So if I had a bunch of documents, I could easily get the one that I want. So I really want to look at Chris Sells. So I'll go ahead and click on Chris and bring up his information. What happened here is the whole thing, the whole chain of communication went back into Chris's TCO model, pulled it out of Excel, brought it forward to my phone. So the beauty of this is that I can see all of Chris's information here. I can scroll through the combines that he's interested in. And I can see ultimately the result of all those combines. So it's great because now I can view that data from anywhere in the world where I've got a cell phone connection. But it doesn't stop there, because what you really want to do is, say I'm the salesperson, I bump into Chris at the grain elevator. And Chris says, oh yeah, I looked at the information. He said, but I noticed on Combine 1, you've got $375,000 for a sell price. That's the list price. A long-time customer, I never buy at list price, man. Now, come on, you've got to do something for me. You're like, all right, yeah, that's an oversight. So, okay, with current incentives, you know, we're gonna sell that to you for $325. So watch what happens here. I put $325 as the sell price. We really want to watch at the bottom the total cost of ownership. So I'm going to go ahead and click refresh. And all of this data gets sent back into Excel services, my Excel model living there, goes through all of the calculations to finally get to a TCO, and brings back the new results. And so now I can see the total cost of ownership is $144. So now, instead of having my laptop or going to Chris's place to go over some stuff, wherever I bump into him, if we start talking about this, I've got the tools right at my fingertips, leveraging this, ultimately, this Excel model that was approved by finance and created by finance, anywhere that's convenient, where I've got my phone. I've always got my pocket. So it's a great sales tool here and a great way to just leverage what we have in Excel, all this business knowledge we already have. Of course, there's more things we might want to do. We might want to save a new copy of this. So one thing I can do, I could either save right now, just save over my results in SharePoint. I can also do a save as, and let's just call this V2. So let's see, we've got Chris Sells V2 saved successfully. And if I go back out to my SharePoint site here and I refresh the page, you can see now I've got Chris Sells V2 back out there in SharePoint. Got a new Excel model. People could download that internally, start working it in Excel client, look at it in Excel services, or other people could, with the same app on their phone, could also see it right there on their phone. So in theory, you could have two salespeople and immediately just look at this on your phone from another device. As I mentioned, the beauty of this is it doesn't limit you to Phone or Windows Phone 7. Well, that'd be great. You could also consume this from other devices because we just got a WCF service there out in the cloud. As long as we can talk to that WCF service, we can really extend this to any device and leverage ultimately our Office document. So one other thing I want to show is I've got this email option. I mentioned that in this Excel document, it's got a lot of proprietary stuff. I don't want to send this model to my customer. I really just want to send them the summary results. So I can go ahead and choose email. Ooh, yeah. Don't want you to have to use your imagination on this one. Okay. Let me go back. So I've got an email option here. When I press that, I'm looking now at the contacts on my phone. So I am talking to Chris Sells. He better be in here somewhere. There he is. And what's happening now is it's making a call through my communication chain here, and we're going to use OpenXML, the SDK on the server, to take this data out of Excel and put it into a Word template that we have. We just want the summary information, and it's just going to push it into content controls in Word, just basically placeholders for data that we want to inject into Word. Now I've got a little dialog here. It says, okay, it saved a document for us. Let me go back out to my laptop here. And I've got a document library called TCO Prospect Letters. And now, let's refresh here. Oh, I'm on using Chris Sells. This was the one that we just created. So I'll go ahead and open that up. Come on now, there we go. And I see I've got Chris's just a summary prospect letter. I've taken the data out of that TCO tool, put it into this Word document. Now I also might want to not send the Word document. Maybe I know Chris doesn't have Word. He's got PDF or something. So I also create a Word Automation Services job to create a PDF version of this. So if I go to TCO Prospect PDF, I don't see it yet because this runs on a timer. So I'm just going to go into the Word Automation Services, my job here. I'm going to force it to run now. By default, this is set up to run every 15 minutes. So rather than wait 15 minutes, we're going to go ahead and force it to run right now. Okay, and I can see it just completed successfully. So if I go refresh, I've got my new Chris Sells letter here. Let's go ahead and open that up, and I've got a PDF that then I could send that to him. I could send it in an email using workflow. The other thing you can do with a phone, if you were on a Wi-Fi connection, you can use the Office Hub. You'd be able to get at all of these using the built-in Office apps too. So I could get at it with the Word one, with Word for mobile. I could get at the Excel document through Excel Mobile if I wanted, and I could email it right from my phone that way too. So code-wise, how are we doing on time here? Okay. So I'm just going to show you some of the highlights here of the code. Probably the biggest thing I'd point out is I'm an Excel guy. I'm an MVP for Visual Studio Tools for Office. I'm not an MVP for Windows Phone. Okay? Who here has developed in Silverlight or WPF, C#? All the stuff that you already know how to do. To create a phone app, it's simple. You do a few things here. It's just like any Silverlight. We see we've got a visual designer. We've got our XAML here. We've got these controls built in for a panorama item, which is our main UI. Behind that, we've got some C# that runs. We add service reference to our WCF service out on Azure here, which is named TCO Forwarder Service Client. I just call methods on that to get my data display it on the phone. It's super simple to do, and you're going to feel really, really at home creating your first Windows Phone app. It doesn't take long to get familiar with it. For the model view itself, we've got a pivot item control, easy to use. We just define the different views here. I've got a view for my facility or my customer. I've got a view for Combine 1, Combine 2, Combine 3 in the summary. Now, in terms of the service, I mentioned I've got a WCF service out on Azure. So we're looking at the computer now where I've got this project. And you see I've got a few different projects within this. The shared project is, in this instance, I've got a WCF service on Azure and one on my SharePoint box. Now, there's an interface and a class library that is shared between the two. So I've just put that in a separate project so I don't have to duplicate code in both of my WCF services. So we're looking at the TCO forwarder service here. And all this is a real thin wrapper around the WCF service I've got running on my SharePoint box. So you can see a method called get models. I want to get a list of all the models in that SharePoint document library. I'm really just going to forward this call to my TCO service project, which is running on SharePoint. And if we look at some of the other names here, you can see all I've done. The only thing that's really changing besides the method name is the method that I'm calling on my TCO service running internally. So this is really simple code once you create your initial service. So I'm going to go into the TCO service, the service running on my SharePoint box now, and we can see the actual implementation of these. So for example, I've got get models. So ultimately, this is a piece of code that's going to go into SharePoint, get that list of models, ultimately send it back to my phone. Now to do this, I use the SharePoint client object model, something that Steve mentioned earlier. That just gives you added flexibility to work with SharePoint data when you're not right on the SharePoint box. In this case, I am on the SharePoint box, but I wanted to use the SharePoint client object model to have flexibility to move this service somewhere else. The other thing that we saw, all of these calls here are really, in fact, let me just open one up. Simple calls into Excel services. Excel services has a web services library. All I'm doing is really making calls into Excel services to just get various ranges that I've named. I've got a named range for a customer name. I just make a call into Excel services, say, hey, can I have the value for a customer name? I get it back. So all of these methods that we see, they're all pretty small. There's not a lot of code behind these. There's just numerous ones because there's numerous bits of data I want to pull out of Excel. So I just kind of reiterate on that this is all pretty easy to do. There's some moving parts, but it's definitely within your reach to do that. I want to add one more thing, though, that from what you were talking about. In the spirit of Azure and Office and really being able to reuse your data and services that you deploy to Azure, for where you've got some VBA code in a document and you really want to bring that forward without redoing it, it's also possible to get at your Azure data in VBA. And to do that, you're going to want to look up something called a SOAP toolkit. Microsoft released it around 2003 timeframe. You can use that to actually get at your Azure data as well.
Cool. So. Great. Thank you very much, Steve. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit, right? You can imagine we started out doing a little simple Excel, no-code solution. We built a service, deployed it into Windows Azure to use it back in InfoPath and using jQuery and JavaScript and Office server-side services. We built a couple add-ins that also leveraged table storage and other parts of Windows Azure. And of course, we finished off with Steve showing us the Windows Phone 7 service bus connectivity to Excel services. So lots of things there that you can do in and around Office. Not only Office on the client, but Office on the server, right? So I know that's kind of a lot, but hopefully just that gave you some ideas as to the types of things that you can do when looking to integrate Office with Windows Azure. I'll leave you with the developer training kit. This is something we literally just put together and released this week. The URL down there at the bottom, even though it says SharePoint and Azure training kit, there's a lot of stuff in there that is Office, so InfoPath, and we have an Office and Azure, an Office and Azure module as well. There's lots of stuff in there that you should be able to leverage as well. Even the Bing Maps is in there as well. So you can download it, check it out. If you go to the booth, again, there's a 3-chapter primer on Azure and Office and SharePoint as well. So definitely it's free. You can pick that up. And, you know, in summary, just there's lots of possibilities, right? And I know today was more, it's 300 level. I'm kind of casting the net here to give you an idea of the types of things that you can do. So hopefully you're walking away with an idea of what you can do with respect to these two technologies coming together. But certainly lots of potential when you think about the intersection between the two. Again, you know, just on the right-hand side of this particular slide, you know, BCS, extensible UI in terms of your add-ins, content types, et cetera, lots of stuff there. And so with that, what I'll do is just what's next. If you wanted to get an environment up and running, you know, we have VMs out there that you can use, developer training kits, the SharePoint sideshow. I've got some code, and we'll put some more code up on my blog. And I'll also get this, this deck out there. It should be available to folks anyway, but I'll definitely get this up on my blog as well. And so with that, you know, I'll hang out with some questions, but enjoy the rest of the week, next couple of days. And thank you very much for attending this 8:30 class. Woo!